The emergency room doors burst open with a sound like a bone breaking. Footsteps. Running. The kind of running that means everything is ending or everything is about to change. Luca Bianchi stood motionless in the center of the waiting area, his tailored charcoal suit somehow still perfect despite the chaos swallowing him whole. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose presence filled rooms the way water fills a glass, completely, inevitably. His dark hair, silvered slightly at the temples, caught the fluorescent lights overhead. His face was carved from stone, all sharp angles and controlled fury, with a scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone like a permanent reminder of violence survived. But his eyes. His dark grey eyes that had ordered men into darkness and commanded empires from whispered conversations, those eyes were drowning. In his arms, wrapped in a small pink blanket, was Emma. 6 years old. The color draining from her small face with each breath that was no longer coming. Rocco and Sal, his lieutenants, stood frozen against the far wall like statues of men who had seen death but never like this. Never from disease. Never from something that could not be shot or negotiated or eliminated by force. Rocco's hands flexed open and closed. Open and closed. His fingers reaching for weapons that could not help. His mouth moving with prayers that belonged to a younger version of himself, back before he learned that God did not answer men like him. The trauma team froze. They were trained for emergencies, but emergency rooms had a hierarchy, and the man holding the dying child carried the kind of weight that made doctors hesitate. 30 seconds of hesitation. 30 seconds that felt like centuries compressed into moments. Then the doors of the waiting area opened again. A woman in a stained white waitress uniform pushed through the crowd, and the entire room seemed to inhale at once. She was small, 28 years old but looking 10 years older from a life that had ground her down to her essential parts. Her hair, a dark, pulled back in a fraying bun, fell partially loose across her neck. Her eyes were blue, the kind of blue that speaks of something broken and still fighting, framed by dark circles that ran deeper than exhaustion. On her throat, fading to green at the edges, were handprint bruises. On her left wrist, a scar that ran in 3 parallel lines like a map of hell. Her uniform hung loose on her frame. She had skipped too many meals for too many months. This was Nora Morgan. She had been eating a cold meatloaf sandwich in the hospital cafeteria at 11:51 p.m., the kind of employee meal reserved for people nobody noticed, when she heard the chaos begin. She did not know who the man in the expensive coat was. She did not know that his name moved through the criminal underworld like a curse. She only knew that a child was dying. Nora moved toward them, and something in her movement, the absence of hesitation, the pure animal instinct to save, cut through the paralysis like a blade. She dropped to her knees beside Emma. Her worn hands, calloused from 2 decades of washing dishes and serving food she could not afford to eat, moved with the certainty of someone who had taken every first aid course she could find free on the internet. She tilted the child's head back. She checked the airway. She opened Emma's small mouth and felt for obstructions with fingers that were trembling so badly they looked like they were vibrating. "Crash cart!" Nora screamed. The words came out raw, fractured with desperation. "Now! Move!" She looked at Luca, and in that moment his grief and helplessness hit her like a physical force. A father. Of course he was a father. The expensive suit and the scar and the 2 men who looked like they could end the world could not hide the fundamental truth written across his face. He was a father watching his daughter die. Nora's hand flew to her purse. A brown leather bag worn thin at the corners, patched in 2 places with duct tape. She ripped it open. Her wallet. She tore it apart. $20. Crumpled and soft from handling. 14 singles, some of them torn at the edges. She had been saving this money for 3 weeks. $34 stood between her and absolute nothing. Between her and missing her sister's next radiation appointment because she could not afford the gas money. Between her and eating nothing but rice for 14 days. She slammed the money on the intake desk. The bill scattered across the white surface like leaves. "Take it," Nora said, her voice low and burning like a candle dipped in gasoline. "Take all of it. Just help her now." The nurse stared. No one moved. "Now!" Nora screamed. The crash cart arrived at 11:49 p.m. 90 seconds after the door opened. 90 seconds that contained the entire scope of a man's powerlessness and a stranger's absolute conviction that this child would not die on this night. Nora stepped back. The medical team moved past her, past Luca, and into the trauma bay. The door swung shut with a hydraulic hiss. Sound swallowed by the machine of the hospital, the steady beep and rhythm of monitors that meant the child was still breathing. Barely. But breathing. Luca stood in the waiting room, utterly still. His expensive coat, cashmere, worth more than everything Nora owned combined, worth more than everything she had owned in her entire life, hung perfectly from his shoulders despite the chaos. His hands, which had signed orders that ended lives, hung at his sides. Useless. Broken. Defective. He turned slowly, and his dark eyes found Nora's across the waiting room. She was not looking at him. She was looking at her empty purse in her hands, at the space where her last $34 had been. Her lips were pressed together so hard they had gone white. Her shoulders had collapsed inward, folding around the sudden realization of what she had just done and what it would cost her. Rocco moved. A small step forward, as if to protect his boss from something he did not understand. But Luca raised one hand, and Rocco froze. "What is your name?" Luca's voice, when he finally spoke, came out like thunder, deep and solid like an oath, the kind of voice that could move armies or end them. Nora's head lifted. She met his eyes for the first time. "Nora," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling like a candle in the wind. "Nora Morgan." "You have nothing," Luca said. It was not a question. It was a statement delivered with the precision of someone reading from a document he had already memorized. "I have enough," Nora said. But her hands were shaking, and they both knew she was lying. He watched her for 3 more seconds. 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. His eyes moved across her face, taking in the bruises on her throat, the scar on her wrist, the exhaustion etched into the corners of her mouth. He was looking at someone who had been broken repeatedly and had somehow refused to become broken in the way that matters most. She was still fighting. Still moving toward danger instead of away from it. "You are going to wait," Luca said. "You are going to wait until Emma is stable. Then you are going to tell me everything." It was not a request. It was a command delivered in the tone of a man who had never been refused and did not understand the concept of refusal. Nora nodded. She did not understand what was happening. She did not know that she had just made a choice that would rewrite every remaining chapter of her life. She only knew that somewhere in the trauma bay, a small child was fighting to breathe, and if she did not stay present in that fight, something essential would break forever. At 11:51 p.m., the monitor flatlined once. For 4 seconds. Then the doctors brought Emma back. But what Nora Morgan did not know, what she could not possibly know, was that the quiet man in the expensive coat had just decided her life would never be the same again. In that moment, watching her kneel beside a stranger's daughter and empty her entire existence into a desperate gamble on hope, Luca Bianchi had made a promise to himself. He would find out who had hurt this woman. And he would make absolutely certain that it never happened again. The waiting room settled into a strange, tense silence. The kind of silence that precedes storms. The kind of silence that changes everything. Now, let us go back. Back to 3 months earlier. Back to the life Nora Morgan lived before she walked through these doors. Back to understand how a woman with $34 in her pocket became the most important person in a crime boss's world. 3 months earlier. The season was turning toward autumn in Los Angeles, and Nora Morgan had stopped noticing seasons. She had stopped noticing most things that were not about counting money and the distance between where she was and where her sister needed to be. The parking lot of Mercy Gardens Elder Care was still dark when Nora's 2008 Honda turned into a space near the staff entrance at 5:44 a.m. Her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Not from fear. From the particular exhaustion that comes when your body is running on 4 hours of sleep and the kind of worry that eats through muscle and bone like rust through old metal. She sat in the car for almost 2 minutes before she could make her hands release the wheel. 26 years old but looking decades older, that is what the mirror told her now. Dark brown hair pulled back so tight it gave her headaches, dark circles under eyes that used to be bright. She was thin in the way that comes from skipping meals, not from discipline. Her hands were calloused from work and from gripping the edge of a sink that morning, reading the Western Union receipt again. $340. Sent yesterday to St. Catherine's Medical Center in Phoenix. That left her with $34 in her checking account and $12.67 in her actual wallet. Rent was due in 3 days. The employee bathroom at Mercy Gardens was empty when she clocked in at 6:15 a.m. Nora locked the door and stood in front of the mirror for exactly 10 seconds, then opened her locker. Inside, in the plastic container where she kept her lunch, sat the leftover scrambled eggs from Mrs. Patterson's breakfast tray from yesterday. Cold now, congealed into a yellow-grey paste with the edges curling brown. The toast was hard as cardboard. She ate it anyway, standing over the toilet, thinking about nothing except the fact that she had not eaten since lunch yesterday, and her hands were steady now, and that was what mattered. The shift began. Mercy Gardens was a facility for people in the last years of their lives, and Nora's job was to help them move through those years with as much dignity as the budget would allow. She changed bedpans and adjusted pillows and spoke to people who no longer recognized anyone. She did this with her hands and her voice while the part of her that was still thinking about money moved through the math constantly. The medical bills from Phoenix now totaled $47,000. $47,000. The number lived inside her skull like a second heartbeat. Melissa's oncologist had explained the treatment plan: 2 more rounds of chemotherapy, then possibly surgery. 2 more rounds meant another $40,000 at minimum. The insurance had denied the claim twice. The hospital was not particularly interested in discussing payment plans with a poor woman who worked double shifts at an elder care facility. By 11 o'clock, Nora's feet had begun to hurt in the way that meant she had pushed too long without sitting. She sat in the break room for exactly 7 minutes, which was all the break she was allowed, and she did not eat anything because the food she had eaten in the bathroom this morning had been the total of what she had allocated for the entire day. By 3 p.m., she had cleaned the rooms on the East Wing, helped a confused man named Walter who kept calling her his daughter's name, and listened to Mrs. Cheng cry about how lonely it was to be forgotten by everyone you had once loved. The afternoon shift ended at 4 p.m. Nora clocked out, walked to her car, and sat in the parking lot with the engine off for 3 minutes. Then she drove to Castelliano's Italian Kitchen, a restaurant in the Arts District, where she worked evenings as a server. She had to be there by 5:22 p.m. for the dinner rush. The evening shift was worse than the morning shift in every way that mattered. The dinner crowd was denser, their expectations sharper. They wanted their wine refilled before it dropped below half full. They wanted their appetizers while they were still deciding on entries. They wanted her to smile while they looked at her the way men who had never been told no look at women who cannot afford to object. By 9:15 p.m., she had been on her feet for 16 hours with only a 7-minute break and the congealed eggs. She left Castelliano's at 11:13 p.m. with $43 in tips. The total, counted in her car in the parking lot behind the restaurant under the sodium lights that turned everything the color of old mustard. $43. One of the tables had left her $2 on a $75 check. Another had left nothing at all, just a napkin with a phone number written on it and the word beautiful underlined 3 times. By the time she drove back to her apartment in El Segundo, a 2-bedroom she shared with a roommate who worked nights and was never home, it was nearly midnight. She had been awake for 20 hours. The apartment was cold. She had stopped paying for the heat in September because the money needed to go somewhere else. Somewhere that mattered more than her own comfort. She counted the cash. $43 plus the $12 left from earlier in the week. $55 total for the next 3 days. Rent would be due at the end of the month. The apartment complex did not accept partial payments. They accepted only full rent or eviction notices, and Nora had already seen one of those notices on the kitchen counter in Phoenix when she drove up to visit her sister 3 weeks ago. That night, she did not sleep. She lay in her bed in the dark and thought about the arithmetic of survival. If she ate nothing except what she could steal from Mercy Gardens, she could save approximately $120 per week. $30 to $40 in tips per night at Castellano's if she worked 6 nights. That was $650 a month, maybe. The rent was $1,200. Her student loans were $400. Car insurance was $90. Gas to drive between jobs was $150. The numbers did not add up. They had never added up. There was always something missing, some gap in the calculation that represented the impossible choice between eating and keeping the car, between keeping the car and making the rent, between making the rent and sending money to her sister's doctors. She had stopped sleeping well around the time her mother died. The next evening, Nora was back at Mercy Gardens by 5:45 a.m. And the evening after that. And the evening after that. By the time 3 weeks had passed, she had made for more Western Union transfers. $400. $530. $375. Each one sent to St. Catherine's Medical Center, Phoenix. Each one reducing the balance in her checking account to a number that barely qualified as money. $34. That was all that remained. The parking lot at Mercy Gardens at 11:36 p.m. on a Thursday in late September. The heat had not broken. Los Angeles heat in autumn is a different thing than spring heat. It is exhausted, aggressive, the kind of heat that makes the concrete shimmer like there is water underneath it when there is only asphalt and the memories of 1,000 cars that have passed over this same ground. Nora did not notice the figure standing beside her car until she was almost upon it. He was 6 feet tall, built the way men who lift weights build themselves, with shoulders that took up space. Dark hair. Handsome in the way that abusive men often are, there is a confidence in their features that registers as attractiveness until you understand that the confidence is built on the certainty that they will never be told no. His name was Douglas Hale. He was her ex-boyfriend, and he had been her mistake made in a moment when she had thought that having someone would be better than being alone. The restraining order that protected her from him was dated 14 months ago. The Los Angeles Police Department had been served with it 18 months ago. His cousin worked in the records department of the precinct 7 blocks from here, and the order had become one of those official documents that technically existed but held no actual power. Nora, he said. Not as a greeting. As a statement of fact, the way you might say the name of an animal you had caught in a trap. She stopped walking. Her keys were in her hand. The car was 3 feet away. She calculated whether she could reach it, unlock it, get inside, lock the doors, and start the engine before he closed the distance between them. The calculation came back negative. It always did. "I don't want to talk to you," she said. Her voice was steady. That was a skill she had learned, keeping her voice steady even when everything underneath it was shaking. "You think you can just walk away from me?" His voice was quiet. That was the thing that made him dangerous. Not yelling. Never yelling. Just this soft, certain tone that suggested he had already decided how this conversation would go, and her participation in it was a formality. "You think you can take my money and disappear? I didn't take anything from you." He closed the distance between them. One hand came up and gripped her wrist. His fingers were strong. He worked construction, owned his own company, had money in a way that she could not even imagine. The grip was not so tight that it bruised immediately. It was a warning grip. A demonstration of capability. "I had $125,000 in that account, Nora. You are the only person who had access to it. You took it." She had not taken anything. He had loaned her $3,000 once, years ago, for her mother's medical bills, and she had been paying him back $50 a month since then, and he had decided this month that she owed him everything. That was how Douglas's mind worked. It was a useful thing to understand about him, because understanding came before survival. "I didn't." The second hand came up and shoved her backward. Not gently. Her shoulder blade connected with the car door hard enough to stun the breath out of her. The impact hurt in a bright, specific way that meant something in her rib cage had cracked. She felt it the way you feel a branch break, a sharp splitting sensation followed by the kind of pain that gets worse when you try to breathe. "You're going to get me that money," Douglas said. "You're going to get me $125,000, and you're going to get it in 3 days, or I am going to make you regret that you were ever born." He grabbed her throat then. Both hands. She tried to pull away, but he was pressing her against the car, and his hands were closing around her neck like he was holding something precious that he was afraid would break if he did not grip it hard enough. Her vision started to darken at the edges. She clawed at his arms, and he pressed harder, and she thought about the money, about Melissa waiting for her next treatment, about the fact that if she died in this parking lot, the medical bills would just stop happening because there would be no one to pay them. Then he released her. She fell to her knees on the concrete, gasping. The air came back in painful, tearing gasps. She could feel the shape of his hands on her throat, already darkening into bruises. Her rib hurt with every breath. She tasted copper in her mouth. She had bitten her cheek or her tongue, she could not tell which. Douglas walked away. Back to his truck. A nice truck, new, probably financed. He turned it on and drove out of the parking lot like nothing had happened. Like he had not just nearly killed someone over money that never existed. Nora stayed on the concrete for a very long time. Not moving. Not crying. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore. From something else. A kind of shock that goes deeper than the body. 3 days. He had given her 3 days to find $125,000. She had $34 and access to cold scrambled eggs. The calculation came back the same way it always did. Impossible. She drove home in the dark, parked the car, and sat in her apartment on the floor of the bedroom with her arms around her knees. Around midnight, she called the police. The officer who responded knew about the restraining order because it was in the system. He also knew that Douglas's cousin worked records, and he took his statement politely and promised to follow up, and she understood in the way that women understand these things that nothing would come of it. By the next morning, the handprints on her throat had darkened into something that looked like someone had tried to choke the color out of her. She wore a scarf to work. Long sleeves, even in the September heat. The work continued. The money continued not to appear. 3 days later, at 6:45 p.m. on Sunday evening, Nora clocked out from Mercy Gardens for the last time that week. She was supposed to go directly to Castellanos for the evening shift. Instead, she drove to Hope Haven, a shelter for children in foster care on the edge of El Segundo. It was the one evening she had carved out for volunteer work, the one place where she could step outside the relentless mathematics of survival and do something that did not produce money or require counting. The shelter was housed in a converted church, a big, drafty space with high ceilings and windows that let in the last light of evening. There were 7 children there that Sunday. 7 children who had been taken from their homes or whose homes had been taken from them, and they were in this transition space where everything was temporary and no one knew what came next. The director, a woman named Patricia with grey threaded through her dark hair and eyes that had learned not to show hope, led Nora to the reading room. It was quiet there. A small bookshelf, some worn armchairs, a window that looked out at the parking lot. "We have a new admission," Patricia said. "Emma. She's 6 years old. She was found wandering 3 miles from her home 2 weeks ago. No identification, no information about who her parents are. She hasn't spoken since she arrived." Nora followed Patricia to the corner of the reading room where a small girl was sitting with a coloring book in front of her, not coloring. The girl was small for 6, with black hair that hung straight to her shoulders and dark eyes that seemed to be looking at something very far away. She wore a dress that belonged to another child, and her socks did not match, and she had the quality of absolute stillness that comes from learning not to draw attention. Nora had learned that 2 years ago. "Hi, Emma," Nora said. She sat down on the floor beside the small chair, not close enough to crowd her, but close enough to be present. "I'm Nora. I brought something I thought you might like to see. She opened her grandmother's recipe book. It was a small thing, bound in leather that was now cracking, filled with index cards written in her grandmother's handwriting and margin notes that told stories. Next to the recipe for cardamom bread, my mother made this when my father came home from the war. He cried while eating it. Next to the recipe for marinara sauce, a recipe for Sundays, for feeding people you love, for remembering that even the smallest meals can hold so much meaning. Emma's eyes moved to the book. That was all. Just a movement of her eyes. This belonged to my grandmother, Nora said. She turned a page slowly. She wrote things next to each recipe. Stories. About people she loved and moments she wanted to remember. Would you like me to read you some of them? Emma did not respond. But she did not look away from the book. Nora began to read. The words came from the margins of her grandmother's handwriting. Stories about family, about loss, about the way food can be an act of love. She read slowly, giving the words space to land. Her voice was the only sound in the room except for the distant sounds of the city outside the windows. Traffic on the street. A siren somewhere blocks away. The cooling system of the church building settling into evening. After 30 minutes, Emma's hand came out and touched the edge of the page. Just the very tip of her finger. A question in physical form. A reaching toward something. Nora did not move. She kept reading. And the small girl, who had not spoken to anyone since she had been found, sat beside this woman she had never met and listened to stories written in margins by a woman who had been dead for 6 years. At 8:02 p.m., Patricia came to find them. Emma had fallen asleep with her head leaning against Nora's leg, the recipe book still open across both their laps. This is the first time she's slept without crying, Patricia whispered. Nora carefully closed the book. She did not move Emma. She sat there on the floor of the reading room at Hope Haven as the light outside the windows turned from blue to black, and she thought about nothing except the fact that the small girl sleeping against her leg had needed something, and she had been able to provide it. The money situation did not change. The 3-day deadline from Douglas did not disappear. Her sister's medical bills did not become smaller. But in that moment, there was something else. A counterweight. A small proof that survival could sometimes mean more than just keeping your body alive. What she did not know, what she could not possibly understand, was that the small girl sleeping against her leg was not actually named Emma, and she did not actually belong to no one. She belonged to a man who had already moved heaven and earth to find her. A man whose phone was about to ring with information that would change the direction of all their lives. A man who, in exactly 93 minutes, would walk into a trauma bay at County Hospital and see a woman kneeling beside a stranger's child and finally understand what his empire had been built to protect. The evening settled into quiet. Outside the church building, Los Angeles hummed with its 10 million lives, and none of them knew that they were minutes away from a collision they could never have anticipated. The evening settled into quiet. Outside the church building, Los Angeles hummed with its 10 million lives, and none of them knew that they were minutes away from a collision they could never have anticipated. At 7:13 p.m., the first fat raindrops hit the pavement outside Hope Haven. The sky had turned purple-black over the city, clouds roiling like something alive and angry. Nora Morgan arrived through the downpour, her uniform still damp from the lunch shift at Mercy Gardens, her left side throbbing with a pain she had learned to breathe through. The air smelled like ozone and hot asphalt turning cold. Emma was waiting in the reading corner, where she always waited now. 6 weeks of visits had turned this small girl into someone who recognized Nora's footsteps, who hummed the same melody Nora hummed while cooking. Emma called her Nora Burr because of that humming, because Nora moved through the shelter kitchen like something with wings, careful and light, teaching a traumatized child that hands could create instead of destroy. But tonight Emma was staring out the window with fear blooming in her small face. "The storm is loud," Emma whispered. Nora sat beside her on the worn carpet, careful of her ribs. "Storms are loud, but they pass. The sky is scared, so it shouts. When it's done shouting, it becomes quiet again. Emma leaned against her, small fingers gripping the sleeve of Nora's sweater. Outside, thunder shook the windows. Lightning cracked across the horizon like something breaking. At 8:15 p.m., the storm peaked. The shelter director, Patricia, was in the office doing paperwork when Rocco and Sal walked through the front doors. They did not belong here. The neighborhood, the mission, the children huddled in corners, none of it aligned with men wearing coats that cost more than the shelter's monthly electric bill. Their shoes were too clean. Their eyes were too hard. Patricia's stomach dropped before she understood why. 30 seconds later, a black Mercedes pulled up outside, sleek and expensive and absolutely wrong for this neighborhood. Luca Bianchi stepped out into the downpour. His coat, cashmere, charcoal gray, worth more than Nora earned in 8 months, soaked instantly. He walked into Hope Haven like a man entering a church and a battlefield simultaneously, water streaming down his face, his eyes moving through the shelter with the precision of someone accustomed to taking inventory of everything he encountered. His eyes found Emma. "Papa!" The word shattered out of the small girl like glass breaking inward. Emma screamed it again, "Papa!" and ran across the reading room, her small body trembling. Nora watched confusion turn to ice in her stomach. Luca Bianchi dropped to one knee as his daughter collided into him. His arms wrapped around her with a tenderness that seemed impossible given the width of his shoulders, the scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone, the way his men flanked him like sentries. He held Emma for a long moment, his face buried in her hair, and when he stood and looked toward where Nora sat frozen on the floor, something in his expression shifted into territory that made Rocco and Sal exchange glances, because in 15 years of working for Luca Bianchi, they had never seen him cry. Patricia stammered explanations from the doorway. They had been searching. No family claimed her. No missing persons report had ever been filed under the name Emma gave them. The shelter director's voice dissolved into background noise because Luca was walking toward Nora, rain dripping from his coat onto the linoleum, pooling at his feet. He was 6'1". His eyes were dark gray, like a storm waiting to break. His hands, when he extended one to help her stand, were warm despite the cold rain. "You protected my daughter when I could not find her," he said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath. "Tell me what you need." "Anything." Nora's breath came shallow. She could feel the rib fracture beneath her uniform, the fingerprint bruises hidden by her collar. She stepped back, shaking her head. "I don't need anything from you," she said. But what she didn't know was that Luca Bianchi had already made a decision that would reshape her entire world. What she didn't know was that her broken rib would seal Douglas Hale's fate. 2 days later, Nora clocked out from her evening shift at Mercy Gardens at 11 p.m. The parking lot was nearly empty, sodium lights casting everything in sickly yellow. She walked to her car and stopped. A black sedan was parked 3 spaces away. Rocco leaned against the driver's side, casual, but his eyes tracked her movement. Sal stood near the entrance to the facility, making sure no one entered or left unexpectedly. Luca emerged from the sedan's back seat. "My daughter speaks your name in her sleep," he said without preamble. "She has not spoken in 3 months until you came. The first word she said in 90 days was your name." Nora pulled her jacket tighter. "I was just kind to a scared kid. That's what people do." Luca stepped closer. His eyes moved across her face and stopped at her throat, where concealer had been applied over handprint bruises that had shifted from purple to sickly yellow-green. His jaw tightened. "Who did this to you?" "It's handled," Nora said. "It is not handled." His voice remained level, but something dangerous stirred beneath it like something waking. "Tell me his name." Nora turned and walked away. She could feel his eyes on her back, the weight of his attention like a physical thing. She was almost to her car when he called after her, not loudly, just a statement of fact. "I have resources. Let me help." She stopped. She turned. The words came out shattered. "Why would you help me? I'm nobody. I eat other people's leftovers. I have $34 in my pocket and $47,000 in medical debt I'll never pay off. You don't owe me anything. Luca walked toward her. With each step, the distance between them shrank. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost couldn't hear it over the hum of the parking lot lights. My daughter's life is not nothing. And neither is yours. Back at the sedan, Rocco and Sal exchanged a look. In 15 years, they had never heard their boss say something like that. In 15 years, they had never seen him stand this close to a woman without calculation in his expression. 1 week passed. Then a manila envelope arrived at Nora's apartment, slipped under her door while she was at work. Inside was a check for $47,000. The memo line read, "I do not do debts." The attached note was handwritten, "Your sister's surgery is covered." Pound. Nora stared at it for 3 hours, her hands shaking. She had spent 2 years working toward that debt. 2 years of double shifts and rationed meals and prayers whispered to a grandmother 6 years dead. She tore the check into pieces. She mailed them back with her own note, "I don't want your money. I want my life to be mine." But what she didn't know was that Luca had already called the hospital directly. What she didn't know was that Melissa Morgan's surgery was now scheduled for the following Wednesday, and the surgical team had been told that payment was guaranteed. Meanwhile, across the city, Douglas Hale was running out of patience. 2 weeks after Nora rejected the check, she was working the dinner service at Sorella's, the upscale Italian restaurant where she had found work 3 months ago. The uniform was black and white. The tips were marginally better. The manager was generally kinder. But on this night, at 8:38 p.m., during the height of service, Douglas appeared in the kitchen. He grabbed her wrist and pulled her into the walk-in cooler. Cold mist rose around them. Pasta boxes fell from shelves. His breath smelled like whiskey and rage. 3 days, he hissed. You have 3 days to get me $125,000, or I will make sure your sister never gets her medication. I know which hospital. Which room? Which floor? Nora's vision blurred from pain. Something in her chest cracked like a gunshot. The rib fracture had reopened. I don't have it, she gasped. I never had it. Douglas pulled a knife. The blade caught the cooler light. He pressed it to her throat, just hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. Then I'll take it from your skin. The cooler door opened. Marco, the line cook, stepped in. Something in his expression made Douglas freeze. He pulled the knife back, pocketed it, and disappeared into the evening crowd like smoke. Nora collapsed. She tasted blood. That same night at 11 p.m., she stumbled into the emergency room at County Hospital with one eye swollen completely shut, handprint bruises darkening her throat in the shape of fingers, her shirt torn, blood visible at the collar. A nurse with kind eyes helped her to a bed. What happened, honey? The nurse asked. Douglas Hale, Nora whispered. His name is Douglas Hale. I have filed for police reports. I have a restraining order. He ignored all of it. The nurse's face went pale. We'll call the police. Nora's laugh was bitter, broken. His cousin is the police. He works downtown. Nothing happens to men like that. But across the city, Rocco was already showing Luca the hospital intake photo flagged by their network. The image showed Nora Morgan's face, one eye destroyed, bruises forming like a map of violence. The order had been given, find Douglas Hale. Find him tonight. 3 days later, at Sorella's during the lunch service, Evelyn Blackwell arrived with 8 society friends. She was 62 years old, with platinum hair and a diamond necklace worth $80,000. Her late husband had done business with Douglas Hale's family. She knew things. She knew how to whisper. I heard the servers here are so desperate they'll do anything for tips, she said to her friends, loud enough for Nora to hear while pouring water. This one probably staged her own assault for sympathy money. Her friends twittered like birds. Douglas Hale is a respected businessman, Evelyn continued, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had never been questioned. These poor girls always lie to get attention. The drama is exhausting. Nora set down the water pitcher with controlled precision. Your salads will be right out. Evelyn smiled like a knife. You should be grateful anyone pays attention to you at all, dear. Most men wouldn't waste the energy. After service, Nora locked herself in the bathroom and vomited. The manager found her there 20 minutes later and pulled her aside in the kitchen. Mrs. Blackwell is a major donor, he said quietly. Whatever happened, let it go. For your job. Nora nodded. She said nothing. She went back to work. That evening at 10 p.m., Luca Bianchi took his regular table, the private booth in the back, candlelit, red leather seats. He ordered risotto he would not eat. He watched Nora move through the dining room with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. When she brought the dish, he asked her to sit. I'm working, she said. 5 minutes, Luca replied. Please. She sat on the edge of the booth. He told her his story. His brother sold the family to enemies 8 years ago. Luca had to choose between mercy and survival. Emma's mother died in the crossfire. He had spent 3 years protecting his daughter while running an empire built on violence he could not escape. His voice cracked. I signed death warrants with these hands. But I could not find my own child. You did what I could not. Nora listened. She saw the human beneath the power. She showed him the recipe book with margin notes, her grandmother's stories woven between instructions for lasagna and tiramisu. Luca read one, smiled sadly. She sounds like she understood what matters, he said. She did, Nora whispered. That's why I can't take your money. It has to be mine. Luca nodded slowly. Then let me offer you something else. Safety. Protection. A chance to rebuild. Nora stood to leave. I don't want to owe you my life. But outside in the parking garage, Rocco and Sal were already watching Douglas Hale's car circle the block for the 3rd time. Tonight would be the last time he ever came looking for her. The parking garage of Sorella's restaurant stretched across 3 concrete levels, and at 11:45 p.m. on a summer night, it was nearly empty. Rain hammered the pavement outside, lightning cracking across the Los Angeles sky like a blade splitting open darkness. Nora Morgan walked toward her car with her keys tight in her fist, her waitress uniform soaked through, her fractured rib throbbing with each breath. She did not hear him at first. The footsteps came soft against the wet concrete, measured, unhurried. Douglas Hale stepped from behind a concrete pillar, and the knife in his right hand caught the fluorescent light above. His eyes were wild, the eyes of a man who had lost everything and blamed her for it. Weeks of surveillance, weeks of police reports ignored, weeks of escalating messages had led to this moment. 3 days. That was the deadline he had given her. 3 days to produce the $125,000 he swore she had stolen from him, money that existed only in his fractured mind, a fiction he had repeated so many times he had begun to believe it himself. Where is it? His voice scraped like broken glass. 3 days are up, Nora. She backed against a parked car, her hands raised. Douglas, I told you. I don't have it. I never had it. You need to. He lunged. His left hand shot out and grabbed her hair, pulling her head back against the hood of the car with force that sent lightning through her ribs. She gasped, the pain blooming white and sharp across her fractured chest. Then I'll carve it out of you piece by piece, he hissed, his breath hot against her ear. The knife came up, and she felt the tip of the blade rest against the thin fabric of her uniform, exactly where the fracture hadn't fully healed. And when I'm done with you, I'm going to Phoenix. I'm going to visit Melissa. I'm going to tell your sister what you really are. Rock bottom. This was what it felt like, the blade against her ribs, her own blood beginning to seep, her vision starting to blur from the pressure on her scalp. Rain soaked through her uniform, cold rain, relentless rain. The parking garage smelled like oil and wet concrete and her own fear, metallic and sharp. She thought of Melissa in that hospital bed, thought of Emma's small hand in hers during story time, thought of her grandmother's recipe book sitting in her locker at Sorella's with handwriting in the margins that said things like "Love goes into this one and this recipe saved me when I had nothing." Something inside her refused to break. Nora drove her knee upward with everything she had left. It connected with Douglas's thigh, and he stumbled backward, his grip loosening just enough. She twisted free and ran. Her shoes slipped on the wet concrete, and she went down hard, palms scraping across the rough surface. Behind her, footsteps thundered. Douglas was on her again, his hand closing around her throat, squeezing, cutting off air. The world began to go grey at the edges. Stars bloomed behind her eyes. She clawed at his wrist, but her strength was nothing against his rage. She could not breathe. The world narrowed to the pressure in her throat, the pain in her ribs, the knowledge that this was how it ended. In a parking garage. Alone. With no one to know. With no one to care. Melissa would never know what happened. Emma would ask where Nora was, and someone would have to explain that sometimes people just disappeared. Then headlights flooded the scene. 3 black sedans emerged from the shadows, silent as ghosts, and parked in a perfect line. The engines cut. The silence that followed was absolute. Doors opened in synchronized rhythm. 12 men in dark tailored suits stepped out into the rain, their movements fluid, practiced, precise. They did not run. They did not shout. They simply moved toward the scene like a machine obeying commands that had been given long ago. Rocco and Sal led them. Their faces were stone. Douglas Hale looked up, still gripping Nora's throat, and the color drained from his face. He recognized what was happening. He recognized the machinery of consequence when it arrived. Luca Bianchi stepped from the center vehicle. He wore a cashmere coat the color of smoke, and it cost more than everything Nora had ever owned added together. He walked through the rain with a calm that was somehow worse than any rage. Each step measured. Each movement deliberate. He knelt beside Nora where she lay gasping on the concrete, her throat bruised purple, her lungs burning. "You're safe now," he said. His voice was quiet, like a prayer. He helped her sit up, and she could feel her body beginning to shake, not from fear anymore, but from the release of fear, from the sudden knowledge that she was not alone. Then he stood. He looked down at Douglas Hale with eyes that held no mercy, no negotiation, no possibility of redemption. "You put your hands on her twice," Luca said. "Once in her apartment when she was younger. Once tonight. You threatened a child in a hospital. You circled this city like a predator, leaving no stone unturned." He paused. "You exist because I have allowed it. Because I did not know you existed. That ends now." Douglas scrambled backward, his hands up, desperation flooding his face. The knife clattered to the ground. "Wait, wait. I didn't know she was yours. I swear to God, I didn't know. Please, please." "She was never mine," Luca said, and those 6 words hung in the rain like a verdict. "She is hers. That is why you do not deserve mercy." Rocco and Sal moved forward in perfect synchronization. They grabbed Douglas by both arms, lifting him off the ground. He screamed. His screams echoed through the 3 levels of the parking garage, bounced off concrete, filled the air with the sound of a man understanding that he had crossed into a world from which there was no return. They dragged him toward the center sedan. His legs thrashed. His voice broke into sobs. He was trembling like a cornered animal, all his rage converted instantly into pure animal terror. The sedan door opened. They threw him inside. The door slammed shut with a sound like the lid of a coffin being sealed. The car pulled forward and disappeared into the rain. Nora sat on the wet concrete, gasping, her hand at her throat. "What will you do to him?" Her voice came out broken, barely a whisper. Luca knelt beside her again. "He will disappear," he said simply. "Completely. No body. No records. No trace. He will become nothing, which is what he always was." By morning, when Nora woke in the private room Luca had arranged for her, Douglas Hale's apartment had been erased from rental records as though he had never signed a lease. His bank account showed zero transaction history. His police cousin found his desk at the precinct reassigned to another officer. He was gone. Erased. Unmade. Not dead, something worse. Forgotten. Non-existent. 3 days later, Evelyn Blackwell made her move. She was a widow, 68 years old, with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon and clothes that whispered old money. Her late husband had left her $17 million, and she had spent 30 years converting that wealth into social power in Los Angeles. She sat on 3 museum boards. She funded charities. She threw fundraisers that determined which organizations lived and which died. She was, to everyone who mattered, untouchable. She had also been Douglas Hale's aunt. The campaign began with whispers and evolved into a roar. Evelyn used her network, society ladies, country club members, local journalists she had cultivated for years, to spread a narrative. Nora Morgan, she said, was a predatory young woman who had seduced Douglas, manipulated him, stolen money from him, and then fabricated assault claims to destroy his reputation. She was a con artist. A gold digger. The kind of girl who ruined good men's lives. Evelyn didn't just tell this story once. She repeated it at luncheons and galas and in carefully worded social media posts that appeared to come from sympathetic friends. By the end of the first day, the posts had gone viral in certain circles, wealthy circles, influential circles, the circles that mattered most to the people Nora worked around. The restaurant owner called her into his office on the second day. His name was Victor, and he had always been kind. His hands fidgeted with a pen as he spoke. "Mrs. Blackwell is threatening to pull her donations," he said quietly. His eyes could not meet hers. "She said if you stay, she goes. And with her goes the foundation grants, the catering contracts, the private events. I'm sorry, Nora. I can't afford to lose that." Nora was fired on a Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday, the landlord of her apartment had seen Evelyn's posts and decided he didn't want to be associated with someone accused of theft and assault. He gave her notice. By Friday, 3 catering companies that had booked her for weekend events called to cancel. Evelyn Blackwell arrived at Sorella's on Friday evening with 2 photographers and a cameraman. She walked directly to the hostess station where Nora was standing and pointed at her with a perfectly manicured finger. "That's her," Evelyn said, her voice loud enough for the entire dining room to hear. "That's the girl who destroyed Douglas Hale's life. That's the girl who falsely accused him of assault, stole his money, and then spread lies through the community when he tried to get his life back." She turned to the cameras. "This is what predators look like. They wear uniforms and smile and tell you their sob stories, and they're destroying good men's lives." Nora stood in her uniform, surrounded by cameras, surrounded by strangers' eyes, and felt her remaining world collapse. The headlines wrote themselves: "Local woman accused of theft and assault, predatory waitress exposed, gold digger's real story emerges." The truth didn't matter. The narrative was already written. The story was already spreading. By that evening, she had lost her job. By the following morning, she had lost her apartment. By Sunday, she was sitting in a hotel room with $34 in her wallet and no clear path forward. That night, Luca's network moved again. FBI agents arrived at Evelyn Blackwell's mansion at 6:44 in the morning with financial warrants and photographs. Her late husband's business, an import-export company that had never been fully audited, had ties to money laundering going back 15 years. Evelyn had inherited more than his money. She had inherited his crimes. And she had continued them, carefully, methodically, using her social position as perfect cover. Documents appeared. Files that should have stayed buried. Accounts that should have been hidden. By noon, Evelyn Blackwell was being arrested on live television, handcuffed in front of her mansion, photographers capturing the moment her empire imploded. Federal charges: conspiracy, money laundering, obstruction of justice. Minimum sentence: 40 years. She screamed at the cameras about conspiracies and setup and injustice, and no one believed her. Why would they? She had just attempted to destroy an innocent girl. She had just revealed the depths of her own cruelty. Now it turned out she was also a criminal. The fall was absolute. Complete. Total. Nora watched it all unfold from the private booth at Sorella's where Luca had insisted she wait safely. The booth was candlelit. The risotto sat untouched, as it always did. And as she watched Evelyn Blackwell's life disintegrate on the television screen, she understood the true scale of what Luca Bianchi had commanded for her. He had not just protected her. He had systematically, methodically destroyed everyone who had ever tried to destroy her. He had erased Douglas Hale from existence and brought federal charges against a woman with $17 million. For a girl with $34 in her pocket. Sometimes one hand reached out at the right moment can change an entire life. The rain hammered against the windows of Sorella's like 1,000 impatient fists demanding entry. Inside the candlelit booth in the back corner, Nora Morgan sat motionless, her hands folded on the white tablecloth, watching the untouched risotto grow cold. 1 year. Exactly 1 year since the parking garage. Since Douglas Hale was dragged screaming into a black sedan and erased from existence like a pencil mark wiped from a chalkboard. Since Evelyn Blackwell's handcuffs clicked around her wrists on live television. Since everything changed. But Nora had changed most of all. The woman who sat in this booth wore a dress she had purchased with money she had earned. Not borrowed. Not given. Earned. The fabric was deep emerald, simple, the kind of dress that whispered rather than screamed. Her hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and there was no tremor in her hands anymore. The tremor had left somewhere between the 4th month after opening Margarita's and the morning the food critic called to ask if she could reserve a table for the following Saturday. For months earlier, Nora had walked into the Los Angeles Community Bank with a business plan written in her own hand. The bank manager, a woman named Patricia with reading glasses on a beaded chain, had studied the papers for 23 minutes. Not rushed. Not dismissive. 23 careful minutes of reading every word Nora had written about her grandmother's recipes and the small bungalow on Sycamore Avenue and the vision of 10 tables where people could gather and remember what it felt like to be fed by someone who loved them. Patricia had looked up from the papers and said something Nora would remember for the rest of her life: "This is not a business plan. This is a love letter." And banks give loans to love letters. The loan was approved at 3:17 that afternoon. Nora had walked out onto 8th Street, and for the first time in 7 years, she had not checked her phone to count her remaining dollars. She had not needed to. The bungalow on Sycamore had been vacant for 3 years. The landlord, a man named Vincent who wore the same expression as someone perpetually disappointed by weather, had expected Nora to ask for a discount or a delayed payment schedule. Instead, she had arrived at his office on a Tuesday morning with a printed lease and a check for the first month's deposit. His surprise was visible like a crack in ice. The renovation took 6 weeks. Nora had done much of the work herself, painting the walls cream and sage green, sanding the hardwood floors until they gleamed like honey, hanging Edison bulbs from the ceiling in patterns that spelled out constellations she remembered from childhood. On the walls, she had painted her grandmother's margin notes directly onto the plaster. Notes like, "Add honey for forgetting sadness." And "This recipe feeds 7 people if you cook with intention." And "Never rush the roux. Good things require time." The opening night was a Thursday in April. 8 customers showed up. A woman named Ruth who had once worked with Nora's mother at a hospital. A couple from 3 blocks over who had smelled the cooking and followed the aroma like children in a fairy tale. An elderly man who came alone and ordered the pasta e fagioli and wept quietly into his napkin. Nora had stood in the kitchen, flour dusting her apron, and understood that she had built something real. Something that existed because of her hands and her memory and her refusal to stop believing that goodness could survive in a world that wanted to crush it. She had not invited Luca. But the flowers arrived at closing that night. White roses and wild jasmine, 24 stems arranged in a clear vase with a card in handwriting so deliberate each letter seemed carved from stone. "You built this. No one else. Elle? She had held the card for 10 minutes. Just held it. Then she had placed it carefully in the recipe book, pressed between the pages with her grandmother's handwritten note about bread dough rising in darkness before becoming light. The following week, a food critic from Los Angeles magazine had called requesting a reservation for Saturday at 8 o'clock. She had asked for a table by the window and had spent 90 minutes tasting every dish Nora offered. The review appeared 14 days later with a photograph of Margareta's storefront at dusk, golden light spilling from the windows like something alive. There are restaurants that serve food, the critic had written. And then there are places where food becomes medicine for a wounded soul. Margareta's is the latter. Chef Morgan takes recipes written in the margins of a grandmother's book and transforms them into something that feels like forgiveness. Nora knew whose influence had placed that critic at her table. She knew with the same certainty she knew her own heartbeat. But she also knew that the words in the review were true. The food was good. The atmosphere was real. The love was genuine. Luca had opened the door, but Nora had walked through it on her own legs, carrying her own weight. The money from the medical bills had appeared quietly, like rain that falls without announcing itself. Her sister Melissa's cancer surgery at Cedars-Sinai was covered through a hospital charity fund. Nora had called the fund's director and been told only that her sister's case had been selected from applications across the state. The probability was approximately 0.003%. Melissa had spent 3 months in recovery, and now, 6 months after surgery, the scan showed no signs of cancer returning. She had moved back to Los Angeles from Phoenix. She had worked the front of house at Margareta's during the grand opening month, greeting customers with Nora's eyes and Nora's smile. Luca had never once asked for gratitude. Never once suggested that Nora owed him anything. He had simply ensured that the people Nora loved were safe and that the world understood consequences. The consequences were still reverberating across Los Angeles like aftershocks from an earthquake that no one else could feel. Douglas Hale's name no longer appeared in any rental database. His apartment building had no record he had ever lived there. The police file on his stalking charges had been archived and was no longer accessible to anyone who might have wanted to claim his legacy. His family had stopped asking questions after federal agents appeared at their home with a folder of evidence that suggested Douglas had been involved in a narcotics distribution network. The evidence was circumstantial. The implication was sufficient. They had asked him to leave the state, and he had disappeared into Georgia or Tennessee or somewhere farther south, into a life where no one knew he had ever tried to destroy a girl who worked double shifts at an elder care facility. Emma had arrived on a Saturday in June, when the heat in Los Angeles pressed down like a physical thing, like the entire sky had turned into an oven and everyone below was slowly being baked into oblivion. She had been with her father, holding his hand with the unself-consciousness of a child who had learned that hands were safe. She was 6 years old, wearing a yellow sundress with white flowers embroidered along the hem, her hair in 2 braids with ribbons woven through. The moment she saw Nora, she had released Luca's hand and run across the dining room like she was flying, her shoes barely touching the ground, her voice climbing toward something like joy. Viviana. You came. That was what Emma had called her at the shelter. Viviana. Not Nora. Some part of the girl's mind had needed a name that felt like a story, like something from a book with happy endings. Nora had become Viviana in the space where Emma lived. Nora had knelt down as Emma collided into her, small arms around her neck, the girl's breath warm against her ear. I told Papa you make the best cookies in the world and he said maybe we should find out if that was true, and he brought me here, and Viviana, it is true, it is the bestest true. Luca had watched from the kitchen doorway as Nora baked her grandmother's recipe while Emma sat on a stool, flour dusting her dark curls, chattering about school and a girl named Sophie who had become her best friend and how she was learning to read chapter books and she was not scared anymore. She was never scared anymore, not since Viviana came back. When Rocco and Sal had watched this scene, their faces had shown something like disbelief. Rocco had whispered to Sal something that only Sal was meant to hear. In 15 years I have never seen him smile like that. Like he is just a man. Like he has something to lose and he does not care anymore that he might lose it. The months had moved forward with the inevitability of seasons changing. Summer had turned toward autumn. The supper club had expanded from 10 tables to 12. A waiting list had formed. People who had eaten at Margarita's told other people, and those people told others, until suddenly Nora Morgan was not a girl surviving on leftovers but a chef with a vision and a gift for remembering that food was love made visible. She had realized something on an evening in August, standing in her kitchen after the last customer had left, the air still warm with the heat from the ovens, her hands aching in that good way that comes from honest work. She had built this. No investor had given it to her. No man had purchased it for her. She had walked into a bank with a dream and walked out with possibility, and then she had turned that possibility into something real with her own hands. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer running. The realization had brought tears, but not the tears of someone who had been saved. The tears of someone who had saved herself, who had stood up from the ground and dusted off her own clothes and chosen her own direction, and had then looked back to realize that someone had been watching the entire time, holding space, asking nothing, offering only witness to her own becoming. That someone was Luca Bianchi. And it was time to tell him what she had discovered. The summer thunderstorm had returned exactly as it had come a year before. Lightning cracked across the Los Angeles sky like a whip breaking. Rain hammered the windows. The air turned cold despite the heat that had dominated August. Nora arrived at Sorella's at 8 o'clock, when the storm was at its most violent, when the wind was loudest and the darkness deepest. Luca was waiting in the private booth. He wore a charcoal suit with an open collar, no tie, and the faint scar along his jawline was visible in the candlelight. He was reading something on his phone, but the moment he saw her, he set it down and stood. She had never seen him stand for anyone. In 15 years, Rocco had told her once, no one had earned that courtesy. Nora slid into the booth across from him, and the candlelight caught her hair and turned it into something that looked like copper catching fire. Luca sat back down very slowly, as if moving too quickly might shatter whatever was happening between them. "You came," he said. His voice was quiet. It did not sound like the voice of a man who commanded empires. It sounded like the voice of someone surprised to find himself still capable of wanting something he could not purchase. "I have been wanting to come for months," Nora said. Her voice did not tremble. "I needed to know who I was when I was not running. I needed to know who I was when I was not afraid." "And who are you?" Luca asked. "I am a woman who owns a restaurant. I am a sister to someone in remission. I am a person that a little girl called Viviana and trusted enough to stop being scared. I am someone who gave her last dollar to a stranger and somehow, impossibly, that stranger turned out to be you." She paused. "And I am here because I want to be. Not because I owe you. Not because you saved me. But because you let me save myself, and that means more than anything else you could have done." Outside, rain hammered the windows. Lightning illuminated the space between them. Luca reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm. His grip was gentle. "What happens now?" he asked. Nora smiled. "Now we see if the most powerful man in Los Angeles can handle dating a woman who will not let him pay for dinner." Luca laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from deep in the chest, the kind that Rocco and Sal heard from the bar and nearly dropped their drinks in shock at the sound. The night continued with rain and candlelight and two people who had learned that sometimes love is not rescue. Sometimes love is witness. Sometimes love is stepping back and letting someone rise on their own terms, and then choosing to stand beside them not as a protector but as someone who understands the value of what they have built. Emma baked in Nora's kitchen the following Saturday, flour on her nose, singing a song about friendship. Melissa visited from Phoenix, visiting her sister's success, crying happy tears at the realization that her family had survived. Nora and Luca walked through Los Angeles rain with no guards, no black SUVs, just two people whose lives had intersected like two lines of light crossing in darkness. And the grandmother's recipe book sat open on the counter, its margin notes visible to anyone who cared to read them, each one a small prayer written in pencil by a woman who had known that love was the only ingredient that truly mattered. In a world that teaches us to take, the bravest thing you can do is give when you have nothing left to lose. Nora had given her last dollar. Luca had given his time and his patience and his willingness to step back. Together, they had built something neither could have built alone. A life. A home. A family. The most powerful man in Los Angeles had learned that true power is not measured in what you control but in what you choose to protect without asking for ownership in return. Sometimes one hand reached out at the right moment can change an entire life. If this story moved your heart, please like this video right now. Share it with someone who needs to remember that their worth is not measured by their bank account. Subscribe and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have a story that will break your heart completely. And drop a comment telling me, if you had only $34 left and someone needed your help, would you give it? Be honest with yourself. We wish you good health, joy, and days filled with peace and happiness. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We will see you again in the next video.